Boa tarde a todos. Sou Andrew Nevins, da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro e da Universidade College London, da Inglaterra. Eu estou muito feliz aqui de fazer parte desse evento que se chama Ciclo Internelis 2020. Ciclo Internelis é um evento que é promovido pelo curso de Letras Libras da UFAL, a Universidade Federal de Alagoas, e pelo programa de pós-graduação de Linguística e Literatura, pelo grupo de pesquisa que se chama Fun UFAL. É muito fun, muito divertido. Fun UFAL. E estamos muito felizes que hoje temos um evento que é produto da parceria entre Letras Libras com pesquisadores de muitas instituições no Brasil e no exterior, como, por exemplo, o caso hoje, que temos a participação da conferencista Daiane Stoyanov. Boa tarde. Daiane Stoyanov, hoje, da UCL, University College London, vai apresentar sobre a pesquisa intitulada Hand Shape Distribution in Emerging Sign Languages. Isso é sobre a distribuição de configurações de mão em línguas de sinais emergentes. Um assunto muito querido ao meu coração e também do coração do nosso intérprete, Anderson Almeida. Boa tarde, vou passar a palavra para a conferencista, que terá aproximadamente 1 hora para sua exposição, e depois teremos tempo para palavras, discussão e debate. Sejam bem-vindos e vamos começar.
Okay. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I hope that everyone can see my screen. Looks like you can. So I will begin. So to start, I would like to talk a little bit about natural systems and some principles that influence them and their structure. Language, of course, is a natural system. And we know that languages have different inventories. They make different choices in what they borrow or use from the available units of that modality. So what vowels a spoken language might use, or what locations on the body a sign language might use. And they also make different choices in what distinctions create changes in meaning, which is to say, languages make different choices both in what perceivable elements it will use in lexical items, so vowels or different hand shapes, different locations on the body, but also how they're organized within that system. Languages might recruit elements from the same toolbox, but use them for different purposes. So both English and Thai, for example, use the feature of aspiration in consonants, but in Thai, this can form a lexical contrast, whereas in English, aspirated consonants only appear in certain predictable environments. But the choices that languages make aren't random. There are factors that influence how languages choose. In any communicative system where information is encoded through some external symbolic medium like language, ease in discriminating between or telling apart those symbols is obviously beneficial. If we think about how traffic lights use red and green, at least partially, because they're easy to tell apart. Or we could say that they are well dispersed within their modality of color. And similarly, in any language which contains only 3 vowels, we might expect to find this maximally dispersed set in the image, which are also the easiest to tell apart. The variables in this case that make vowels different from one another perceptually, so vowel height or vowel frontness and backness, are maximally different. The idea of economy also influences the elements within systems which rely on differences to encode different messages. So using minimal differences to produce a maximal amount of variance. You might think of this similar to the way in which food companies might have one basic recipe with just one variable which produces many variants. Manufacturers of a potato chip might have one basic recipe, which they spray flavors on the outside, producing many variants with minimal tools or changes. This is economical both literally in the example for manufacturers, but also in terms of exploiting one difference to yield a high amount of variance. Tone in spoken language might be thought of as a very economic feature. It can double or triple or more the different lexical items you get from the same recipe of a syllable, for example. And ease, of course, we expect any natural system to be inclined towards elements that are easier, that expend less energy. Language has evolved just like any other natural system, and it's no exception to nature's tendency to prefer to follow this principle of energy conservation. But since language has the communication of information as one of its goals, we have both the ease of the speaker or the signer to think about, as well as the ease of the encoded signal being perceived by the receiver. And ease of articulation overlaps with the final point here, but I want to highlight it as a concept on its own, because it will play a big part in the focus of our research question: the idea of markedness. So this concept of markedness is an attempt to capture the observation that features within systems are not distributed equally frequently. But the idea of being marked or unmarked is just a characterization or a label to capture the reality of how elements tend to be distributed in actual systems. So what makes a marked or unmarked feature? Well, in language, unmarked features are easier to articulate, maximally dispersed, and more frequently occurring. So if a vowel system had the 3 vowels in the image, in addition to others, not only 3, we might still expect the 3 to occur relatively frequently. Marked elements are also acquired later and lost first in cases of language deficit. And this generalization is well supported by acquisition data and deficit studies. So like how within spoken languages, not all vowels are equally frequent within and across languages, in part because of things like dispersion theory and markedness. Our goal in the analysis that I'll present is to explore the distribution of hand shapes within an emerging young sign language, with a focus on markedness and whether it's upheld. So there are a couple of important things to note about sign language phonology in general before we get into the meat of this. One important similarity between signed and spoken language phonology is that in the same way, spoken languages use sounds available in the modality to combine and recombine to form words. Signs in sign languages are also made up of discrete units, like hand shapes, that combine to form lexical items, that combine to form signs. And just like how one difference in a sound in a word, or even a single feature difference, like voicing, can result in a word with a different meaning, so also can one difference in a hand shape or a location feature result in a different lexical sign. But there is one key difference to pay attention to. Sign languages have two dual articulators, right? So the dominant hand and the non-dominant hand. The exact representation of the relationship between them varies in different theoretical phonological models, but there is general consensus that the non-dominant hand is strongly underspecified compared to the dominant hand. So what this means is that generally if signs are two-handed, the non-dominant hand functions either as a copy of the dominant hand, so specified for the same set of features, and where the two hands don't share the same set of features, the non-dominant hand is often used as a place of articulation, and even if not, generally restricted to unmarked hand shapes or features. So the principles I mentioned in the beginning are kind of modality general, language-wide. But now that we're thinking of sign language and sign language phonology, there are a couple more influences specifically on sign form that I want to discuss in a bit more detail. In terms of language typology, we might come across unpredictable factors that are kind of down to elements of the local culture in which a language emerges or is used. Non-verbal gestures are, of course, extremely prevalent everywhere. And we know that sign languages make use of these, both as gesture, because signers still gesture, not everything they do with their hands is signing, but also within the systems of sign languages themselves. What is gesture and what isn't, and how elements of gesture might cross over from being used purely as gesture to something used by the phonological or syntactical system can be difficult to tease apart, especially if we're working on a sign language of a culture that, or a community that we're not a native part of. There was actually a very nice recent talk by Victoria Nist on the subject, how she attempted to do this with some sign languages of West Africa. And there's a link in the references if anybody is interested. But so when we're thinking about sign language phonology, or in other words, what are signs comprised of and how do those elements interact? We need to think about the influence of gesture on form. we know that many cultures use head movements to signal negation, and that these can and do interact with the syntax and surface forms of sign languages. A single backwards head tilt is a widespread gesture for negation in Southeastern Europe and Turkey, as I learned when I studied abroad there during my undergrad, and was often left waiting for a response to a question, not realizing that one had already been given with this head tilt. So unsurprisingly, this gesture has been utilized by Turkish Sign Language and is now distributed in predictable contexts in the language. It co-occurs with manual negation signs and undergoes some phonological processes like spreading. But the fact that these contexts are predictable suggests that it has become part of the linguistic system and isn't just functioning as gesture, which isn't used predictably. In 1960, Charles Hockett proposed a set of design features of language in an effort to demonstrate how human language is different from animal communication. Some of the features of language are shared by animal and human communication, but they are mostly the features more tied to the physiology or biology of vocalization, production, or reception. But the last few features on Hockett's list were proposed as unique to human language. So things like displacement, being able to talk about things that aren't here right now, or abstract things, or productivity, the ability to create a potentially infinite number of new utterances, and arbitrariness. Arbitrariness can be a property of language, but also of any communicative system which uses some kind of symbols to encode information. But if a symbol in that system is arbitrary, it means that there's no motivated link between its meaning and its form. And the examples I've included in the slide of two British road signs. The sign on the left signifies that the national default speed limit applies. There's no connection between its form and its meaning. As a user of the system, you just have to learn it and remember this imposed connection. But in contrast, on the right, you have a sign with a form that is motivated by its meaning. I'm sure you can guess. It's a warning for ice on the road. But more like the first example, many words in spoken languages are arbitrary, which is to say the form of many, maybe even most words isn't motivated by their semantic meaning. But as a field, we've moved away from the idea that arbitrariness is a necessary design feature of language, not only because the study of sign languages subsequently showed us that this was an assumption based on spoken language, but even then, more recently, with the understanding that there are many motivated mappings of meaning and form that are found in both signed and spoken languages. So like the example in the British road signs, the relationship between the form and the meaning can be arbitrary, but it can also be motivated. And this isn't just seen on the level of the whole sign or word, as any advocate of usage-based conceptions of language will tell you, like Corinne Aquino, who writes, languages can and do associate meaning with phonological and even featural level content. So what might this look like in practice? Well, two-handedness is often used by sign languages to encode inherently plural concepts. And Aquino proposes in her work that specific hand shapes can cluster around certain schematic meanings or concepts like interlockedness or tightly fitting objects. In other words, meaning can be a predictive factor, not the only factor, but it can be a predictive factor of something like two-handedness or the use of certain hand shapes. Of course, you might notice these kind of iconically motivated influences on form have the potential to compete, as it were, for influence on eventual sign form with some of the principles that I discussed earlier. So if we think about the British Sign Language sign for cow, iconicity here has taken precedence over markedness in the hand shape, and maybe location too. But this hand shape is marked, and as we'll see, relatively difficult. But there are also pressures on iconic representation, which I think is useful to think about as a potential tool for use by a language. This kind of transparency of elements of the signal has benefits for the receiver, as you can imagine. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to assume any learner of the system of British road signs might have an easier time remembering or recalling the sign for ice than of the other more arbitrary sign. And there's been work showing that iconicity helps facilitate acquisition. So with this in mind, what might be some determinant factors in whether this potential tool is used or not? Well, semantic affordance plays a role. The question of whether the semantic meaning is easy to encode in a transparent and iconic way. So snow or ice is easier to depict than the rather more abstract concept of a speed limit. Function words in spoken languages might be more difficult to encode iconically, for example, than animal noises or verbs of motion. And if we think about sign languages, the use of embodiment, so acting as the agent of an action, might make verbs by a human agent more likely or more easily encoded iconically. Conceptual salience is also a factor. Whether there are conceptually salient, easily accessible, conceptually speaking, elements of a referent that can be exploited by iconicity. I would imagine most of us have never seen a snowflake up close in a microscope, but it's a well-known depiction for ice or snow. So the sign works well within the system. When Kachman and her colleagues tasked hearing non-signers with inventing new signs for animals, they overwhelmingly picked the same elements to depict, not just in this study, but in many studies on hearing non-signers and signers. When people are asked to create new signs, whilst there is a wide array of elements to choose when depicting a referent, there is often the tendency to choose the same one, at least within certain semantic domains. And this is what the authors called the most conceptually salient. I think this also is partially the reason why so many sign languages share significant overlap of surface forms for the same lexical items, despite being often unrelated languages. Young and emerging sign languages also tend to use iconicity to encode information very frequently. Have a large amount of signs that are iconically motivated. And this link is something that might be lost or weakened over time. We have the example from ASL in the image for a tape recorder, which was once articulated with the hands moving in the same direction, iconically motivated by how the tape actually turns, but has come to be articulated with the hands moving in opposite directions, presumably because it's easier to articulate. And young sign languages are often organized around iconic schematic representations rather than specific feature differences that result in minimal pairs or semantic contrast. And we've seen from cases such as ABSL, Al Said Bedouin Sign Language, this kind of systematic level of phonological organization may be emergent rather than present from the beginning. So, for example, signers might all represent a hammer with how it's used, or a chicken with its beak, but no two signs by signers will match each other for every phonological feature specification. The selected fingers might differ, or the type of movement, but they're all aiming for the same referent with the same method of representation. So if we know that a young sign system is more likely to rely heavily on iconicity as a resource for sign form motivation, the important question for my topic today is, how might this affect sign form in terms of the principles I outlined in the beginning of ease of articulation, or the presence and distribution of more marked forms of elements that are very well dispersed? If a young sign system is likely to be prioritizing the creation of more holistic representations, will we see these cross-linguistic principles kind of take a back seat until the lexicon is more stabilized? We can see from existing work on young sign languages that such elements like, more marked uses and locations on the body are present in the early stages of a language and lessen over time. The work of one of my fellow presenters at this conference, Ana Mineiro, and her colleagues who work on São Tomé and Príncipe sign language had some nice examples of this. The sign for aeroplane used to be articulated with the arms fully extended out to the sides, but that's now been reduced to a one-handed sign in front of the body. And in the same language, the sign for bicycle, which used to use both the hands and the legs, but has been reduced to now only using the hands, which of course is less iconic, right, as well. And in this case, if we expect to find these things, might we also expect to find difficult hand shapes, less restricted behavior of the non-dominant hand, if all of these elements are being not ignored, but if something like iconicity in the effort to create kind of more holistic representations, will this have an observable effect on the distribution of elements usually very affected by these cross-linguistic principles? So to say it a bit more neatly, to be a bit more specific with the research question, considering that this system is likely to be more iconic, or that signers are more likely aiming for a more holistic representation, will the distribution of hand shapes diverge from what we would otherwise expect with regards to principles like markedness and perceptual distinctiveness? And if we think about some claims within the field of emerging sign language phonology, such as the idea from Aronoff and colleagues who work on ABSL, that ABSL, and by extension other young sign languages, can possess hierarchical phrase structure, but lack a stable phonological system. Or, in other words, that language can be functional and structural in other ways, but with no real or stable organization kind of below the level of the word or the sign. So I think this invites the question, how systematic is the featural system of our data set, or that of any similar young sign language? Our aim here with this analysis was to answer the question of whether, if at all, it's organized according to the principles that I've discussed. So onto the data. The analysis uses data collected with deaf signers from an indigenous community in Minas Gerais, the Mashakali community. You can see the location on the map. As far as we know, the sign language has had no contact with Libras or any other sign languages. There's quite a lot of information here to give you some context of the community, so I'll give you a moment to read the text. And following a trip a few years ago that my PhD supervisor and our chair today, Andrew Nevins, made to the community with some colleagues. I met Andrew a while later at UCL, and we ended up collaborating on this analysis of the data. And at the time, nothing had been written about the sign language there, but doing something that kind of required the teasing apart of semantic content of the responses was outside the scope of a master's thesis. But I still wanted to do something interesting and useful in terms of sign language phonology and typology. So I carried out a purely descriptive analysis of what elements made up configurations and how they were distributed across the data. So I was looking at form rather than content, and you might like to try and do the same as I show a couple of short clips from the data.
Eles tiveram um filho, mulher engravidou, e aí não vim ficar. Fiz aqui a aldeia. Eu cũng nằm một bữa sáng này về cái bicicleta ele cai.
So for my master's thesis, I analyzed all the video data they'd collected, which was a mixture of responses to standard lexical elicitation tasks like the pair story, as well as spontaneous conversation. And like I said, the analysis was concerned with what hand shape, location, movement features comprised configurations and how they were dispersed within the system. And the goal was to see how the data patterned with principles such as markedness. I should note quickly that I use the term configuration to avoid any implication that I'm proposing lexical signs or drawing boundaries of where one sign ends and the next begins. So I use the term configuration to refer to any combination of features at any one time. So what do the results tell us about how features were distributed in the system? Here are the 12 most frequent hand shapes found in all configurations. The key on the left shows the image in the center is the hand shape. Number on the top left is the overall frequency, and the percentage in red is for all the tokens that were on the non-dominant hand, what percent were a copy of the dominant hand. The reason that I include this figure about copies on the non-dominant hand is because if the data does follow the principles of organization that are observed cross-linguistically, which is to say the non-dominant hand is phonologically restricted, we would expect a higher percentage of more complex handshapes occurring as copies, right? If you remember from the beginning, the non-dominant hand is usually either a copy of the dominant hand or is restricted to a set of unmarked handshapes. So when we do see occurrences of more complex handshapes on it, we would expect them to be copies a high proportion of the time. And the results did reflect this. As you go down the list of handshapes in descending order of frequency, there are more cases of handshapes either not occurring on the non-dominant hand or occurring 100% of the time as copies. So what about markedness more generally? Well, if we take Robert Battinson's proposed set of unmarked handshapes in American Sign Language as a starting point, and think about if the properties ascribed to unmarked units are higher frequency, freely occurring on the non-dominant hand, articulatory ease, and maximal dispersion. Well, if we work through these in order, frequency we just saw, 4 of the 7 were among the 10 most frequent handshapes. All of the set, except 1, appear in the data, and they accounted for half the handshapes found on the dominant hand, so pretty frequent. Concerning the behavior of the non-dominant hand, all 6 occurred on the non-dominant hand, both as copies and as distinct handshapes, showing, again, what we would expect, unrestrained occurrence on the non-dominant hand. And we're left with ease of articulation and perceptual distinctness. So how do we measure these? For ease of articulation, I will try to rather quickly present a model of quantifying handshape difficulty, and for distinctiveness, we will think about the data in light of some existing experimental work on handshape confusability. So here's where things get a little bit technical, but luckily you should all have the equipment to follow along and test them out yourself, which is your hands. Jean Ann came up with this model of measuring ease of articulation, and I think it's useful because it provides a numerical measure of a scale of difficulty. So we can plot this against something like frequency to very easily test markedness. And she calculates these with 5 criteria and ends up with a numerical score. So here on the screen is how to calculate the first score. She categorizes handshapes into 4 groups, seen down the left-hand side. And this score concerns which muscle groups we need to make each type of handshape and whether they work in opposition or not. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through what each muscle group controls, so you will have to take my word for it. But we can see that for the first 2 handshapes, they only require 1 group of muscles, so they're the easiest. Closed handshapes are given the lowest score because naturally you can feel if you just lie your hand on the table with the palm up, the hands have a natural tendency to be closed rather than extended. And for the last two, they both require two muscle groups, but only those in curved hand shapes work in opposition. So we have the numerical scores given accordingly down the side. The next score is given based on whether the selected fingers in a hand shape can easily extend independently. So if you try to raise your middle finger or ring finger, you can feel that the other fingers want to raise as well. These two fingers don't have an independent muscle. So hand shapes with these two fingers extended on their own get a score of 1, everything else a 0. The next score is based on whether the middle ring and pinky fingers are doing the same thing. There's a single muscle that controls these three fingers, so they like to stick together. If they're all doing the same thing, the hand shape gets a 0, and if not, a 1. The fourth score is assigned to any hand shape in which the thumb opposes the fingers. This uses a specific muscle, which you can feel along here. And it's additionally difficult for the thumb to oppose the fingers further away, so the pinky finger or the ring finger. And so if we have any hand shapes where the thumb touches the ring finger or the pinky finger, we get a score of 1. Everything else is 0. And the final score is assigned to curved or extended hand shapes. If we extend all of our fingers, we can feel that the fingers naturally want to be spread apart, and it requires extra effort to push them back together. So if we have any extended or curved hand shapes that don't have fingers spread, they get a 1, otherwise a 0. So that's the most technical part over. Here are the scores resulting from the 10 most frequent hand shapes in the data. I'm not going to talk through the equation and how the final scores are reached in the interests of time. But the main thing to take away is that in the table overall, we can see there's a slight inverse relationship between frequency and ease scores, right? So in other words, the more frequent hand shapes generally have a lower difficulty score, meaning that actually the data largely upholds the principle of markedness with relationship to frequency and ease. And we see that this holds throughout all the results. So here are all the hand shapes and their frequencies grouped by difficulty score. Each color is a different difficulty score, orange being 0, the easiest, and increasing to the right. We can see that 0 was the most common score, and hand shapes that were the most frequent tended to have lower difficulty scores. So this inverse relationship between frequency and difficulty is reflected throughout. And after last time I presented this, I tried a few different weightings of the equation to see how they affected the results. I will show you them quickly, but I'm not going to spend too much time explaining them. Here, the only difference was that the most frequent hand shape is given a score of 2 instead, and generally it increased the range of the higher scores up to 6. And here I disregarded her equation entirely and just added all the scores together. And this version really reduced the 0 category, giving many frequent hand shapes a higher score. And again, increasing the range. So it seems really that her original model correlates with what we would expect from markedness the best. So lastly, in our list of properties of markedness was perceptual distinctiveness. If we think about our results in terms of a study with ASL signers in a visually noisy environment, the 3 hand shapes that they found to be the least confusable were the 3 given on the bottom left. The properties of markedness would lead us to expect that these occur in the data, which they do, 2 of which very frequently, and to occur on the non-dominant hand, often not as copies, which again, they do. So I want to just touch briefly on one of the limitations of the analysis is that it didn't account for pointing or deictic signs, which we know are prevalent in sign languages in general, but additionally in emerging sign languages, which tend to use real-world locations to refer to a person. They might point to the location of their house instead of using syntactic space. And this is also seen with color signs. Before lexical color signs emerge, here there were purple stripes on the man's shorts. So I chose this still from the video data to show how the use of pointing or other real-world motivated signing might present oddities to the data. At least in hand shape here, for example, the woman is using a relatively marked and difficult hand shape to point, also using her non-dominant hand. So I think I will skip forward to my conclusions here in the interest of time. So I've just briefly skipped over a part that made the case for paying attention to gesture, as I said in the beginning, as a potential influence on sign form. I think we need to exercise care there when thinking about the role of ambient gestures from the community. And also, if we think back to the idea that the phonological or sublexical level of a young system can be unstable or unorganized. And on the contrary, actually, we find evidence for Handshape as a domain of organization, and the distribution of marked handshapes and unmarked handshapes reflects what we would expect in terms of frequency, in terms of dispersion, in terms of the relationship between frequency and difficulty, and in terms of the occurrences on the non-dominant hand. So we propose that Handshape as a category, it is organized, at least according to the principle of markedness, even though the system is likely highly iconic. I think this creates interesting space to think about how phonological principles like markedness function within iconicity, perhaps. We're still in touch with the community that I was going to introduce, but in the interests of time didn't end up doing so. But just a detail about our future plans. We are interested in collecting sentence structures from signers to look at, among other things, variations in nouns and verbs with a view to compare data across two other similar young sign languages. So hopefully more interesting insight into young sign language typology. So that's it from me for the presentation part. I will stop sharing my screen.
Hi, everyone. Olá a todos. A gente tem perguntas que eu acho que também o host, o Jair, vai projetar. A primeira, eu estou vendo aqui, vou ler, vem do André Xavier, que pergunta sobre os sinais onde tem configurações de mão mais complexos. Será que eles também são mais complexos em outras propriedades articulatórias, como tipo de movimento, ponto de articulação ou handedness? André Xavier asks about the signs that have more complex hand shapes, whether they also happen to be more or less complex in relation to other parameters such as movement type, place of articulation, or handedness.
So this is a great question, which I would have the ability to answer in the data, but seeing as how I have separated the sections for analysis of each to present, I would need to kind of go back and look at how each phonological domain in a given configuration patterns with the other phonological domains in that same configuration. So an answer to your question is possible, but I would need to go back to the data set. But it's interesting. I'll have a look at that.
Ok, thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela pergunta. Outras perguntas? Ciclo Internelis pergunta por que vocês escolheram Mashakali como primeiro conjunto de dados empíricos? Why did you choose Mashakali for your first research?
This question, I guess, could be answered both by Andrew and I. So when I was doing my master's in linguistics, Andrew had mentioned something about sign language phonology in a lecture, and it piqued my interest. And I approached him to ask whether we could maybe do a project on sign language phonology. And he mentioned that last time when he made this trip to the community, they were told that people in the community signed, and it didn't look like this was Libras. So they took some footage, and I ended up getting involved after. I thought it was a really unique opportunity to think about sign language typology, looking specifically at a young language. That was how I came to be involved.
Okay, excellent answer. Megan Kornhorst asks, the idea of marked locations is very clear what that would mean, but what would marked movement be? Em português, a ideia de pontos de articulação marcados é relativamente óbvio o que seriam, mas o que seria movimento marcado?
Yeah, so I did mention marked locations, using the body or locations in the body that were unusual in more established sign languages. I did break down the movement features of signs into 4 categories. So no movement, internal movement, so the movement of the wrist or the hands, path movement, which moves the whole hand through space, and both types together. So maybe something like this. So I did look at those, and the question of what are the maybe marked types is quite interesting, because when we look at more established sign languages, often a well-formedness constraint is that signs need movement, right? A sign has to have movement. This is interesting because logically, we might assume the more complex form is the more marked form. So both types of movement at once. But it also seems that maybe through the emergence of a syllable structure, a sign going from location to a movement to a location, that maybe hasn't happened yet, hasn't emerged yet in younger sign languages. You get this kind of, you could say that what is marked for movement, what is unmarked rather, is kind of a bell curve. So you have the unmarked elements being maybe one type of movement, which established sign languages tend to represent a much larger proportion of signs, one type of movement, and the marked forms being no movement or both. So that's one way of thinking about what is marked movement.
Muito bem. It looks like we have, is there a last question? Yes. Ciclo Internelis asks, Professora Daiane, how does the syntax establish an interface with Handshape? Como que funciona uma interface entre configuração de mão e funções, relações da sintaxe.
So maybe one way to think about this would be in the emergence of distinct syntactic categories. So nouns and verbs, for example. I think the literature suggests that this division of syntactic classes is emergent. Young sign languages display the beginnings of a kind of systematic difference in form. So you might have the a sign for sit and chair might be very similar in form, but over time the verb form might emerge to be one single movement, and the noun might be a repeated movement. So something like this. This could be one way that the emergence of syntactic classes in a systematic way throughout the language might have an impact on form, as receivers need to tell the difference, right? Is the sign chair or is it sit?
Just a minute. Okay, we have another question from Leticia Hanada. Hi, Diane. I am researching non-manual expressions in Brazilian Sign Language, Libras, as part of the prosody and syntax, and I thought your presentation was very interesting. I really appreciate it. Diane, eu estou aqui pesquisando expressões não manuais, marcação não manual em Libras, como parte da prosódia e sintaxe, e achei a sua apresentação extremamente pertinente e interessante. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I did briefly look at non-manual features in the original analysis. It's hard to comment on anything to do with prosody, because this kind of requires an understanding of boundaries, right? Either semantic boundaries or clause boundaries. But just from my kind of unscientific observation, it did seem like the non-manuals that I observed varied greatly in what their kind of boundaries across configurations were. So again, an unscientific observation, but it didn't seem like these were being used, being repeatedly used over the same, maybe to mark the same boundaries of signs or clauses or phrases.
Ok, a gente tem a última pergunta, mas depois, com certeza, eu acho que a Daiane vai ficar muito feliz de receber mais perguntas por e-mail, né? O e-mail dela deve ser relativamente fácil de encontrar, talvez está no site da Internet. Mas temos uma última pergunta do André Xavier de novo, sobre se existir, whether you have a correlation between complexity in articulation and meaning, se houver correlação entre a complexidade de articulação e o significado daquele sinal. Depois a gente pode encerrar e continuar por e-mail.
So, like I said, the analysis was kind of looking at form only. So I really I don't know how this might interact with the semantic meanings yet of signs in the data. But this is one of the reasons why it's a shame we ran out of time at the end. I didn't have a chance to explain that this is one of the things I'm interested in looking at as we move forward with a new project, to look at actually both your question and the question about how it interacts, how the complexity might interact with syntax, and maybe different semantic domains or different types of nouns, whether they're a human agent or not. So looking to elicit data where we can establish with a bit more certainty what the semantic content is by eliciting kind of fairly simple argument structures with a subject, a verb, and an object, to then see how this patterns, how complexity, or how difficulty of hand shape or iconic representation might, exactly as you say, interact with meaning or different syntactic classes. Yeah, I'm very interested in this too, and I hope to look at this in the next upcoming project.
Ok, então a gente fica no aguardo para a próxima, né, edição de Internelis, talvez em 2021. Muito obrigado a todos pela participação, pelas perguntas. Muito obrigado para Jair, professor Jair, por ter organizado, né, numa maneira extremamente eficiente e suave essa apresentação, esses eventos. Quero convidar vocês todos a participar em mais eventos de Ciclo Internelis no futuro. E quero agradecer a nossa conferencista, Daiane Storiada, pela excelente apresentação, com as ideias, né, muito provocantes e interessantes para todos nós. E, last but not least, quero agradecer nosso intérprete Anderson Almeida, que fez um excelente trabalho em codificar, transmitir, transferir e carregar sobre a ponte do outro lado do rio, né, uma modalidade muito especial, o conteúdo aqui para a relevância e acessibilidade de todos. Muito obrigado e boa tarde.